Hey, with your evening story channel, I post new interesting stories every day. Subscribe and click the bell to not miss it. Camille waited impatiently at the bus stop. She was already late, but the previous two were so full that they didn't even stop at her stop. And then another bus pulled up, also crowded, but two people got off and Camille exhaled and squeezed through the door. Some woman who had to squeeze in. She started to protest, but when she turned to the exit and saw her grandmother, she quieted down. The people shunned, letting the grandmother go forward. She held a wreath in front of her and pushed them all away. But no one said anything against her. She was clearly on her way to a funeral, and the wreath was for her closest loved one. In large letters on the ribbon was written to her son from his mom. Obviously, the old woman was having a hard time. The man gave her a seat. The grandmother sat down, mumbled an inarticulate thanks to him, clutched the wreath, and covered her eyes. Her son's death was out of her mind. In 2 months, Stephen would have turned 50. He'd passed away so suddenly, and the cause of death had somehow been a drug overdose. Camille blamed herself for it. She couldn't imagine her son using drugs like that. Even though Stephen was an adult, but a mother always feels responsible. Her son wasn't a dysfunctional element. He was a university teacher, head of the chemistry department, with 25 years of experience. He loved his job. He complained, though, sometimes about the students. He had a hard time with them, but not to the point of getting hooked on drugs. He didn't know what it was like to go crazy at that age. Camille didn't know what to think now. Maybe he had shared his worries with her. He didn't want to upset his mother. She was sure that he had more or less everything normal in his life. She didn't expect anything bad. And then all of a sudden this happened. 2 stops before the desired stop, an elderly woman jumped up and started making her way to the exit. Then she stood and waited impatiently for the bus to pull up to the cemetery. She was late, but she hoped she would have time to say goodbye. As soon as the doors opened, she jumped out and flew like a bullet, whispering to herself under her breath that she had to make it in time. Meanwhile, colleagues and family members had said goodbye to the deceased Stephen. The coffin was already lowered into the grave and was about to be covered with earth. Suddenly, people noticed an elderly woman running with a wreath. The gravediggers, along with everyone else, stared in that direction. The woman was shouting and waving her arms. People froze, looking at each other. Some were whispering, wondering if anyone knew the grandmother, but everyone quickly realized who she was. "Stop, stop," Camille shouted. "Let me say goodbye to my son." Someone called to the gravediggers to pull out the coffin. An old woman crossed herself and wailed that it was bad luck to pull out a dead man. The gravediggers rushed to the coffin, but the young woman stopped them. "So don't touch it," she demanded. It was the dead man's wife. She had paid for everything and made all the arrangements with them. So they couldn't disobey her. Perhaps she believed in bad omens too. There was already a disagreement among those present about what to do. Some were on the mother's side, while others were in favor of the fact that the coffin absolutely should not be taken out. In the meantime, the young daughter-in-law met the mother-in-law, who ran up and blocked the way to the grave, saying that she was already late, and it was too late to make a fuss. "Next time come on time," Emily declared. "No one will change anything for you." Some were aghast at such a harsh statement of the young widow. Did anyone understand? After all, the girl lost her husband. She's also in shock. Just recently, we were celebrating a wedding, and now the funeral. Emily didn't care about the opinion of others. She did not hesitate to express herself, reprimanded her mother-in-law, and called her a selfish mother. The girl's attitude towards her was extremely negative. Camille didn't like her sister-in-law either, and now that Stephen was dead, she hated her even more. The old woman believed that it was because of Emily that her son was in the coffin. It was her influence that made him try drugs and want to be young. Stephen had been a bachelor for a long time after his divorce from his first wife, and now he was involved with a young student. This alone made his mother suspicious. It is not known what place he was thinking, 25 years of work, and even in his youth did not throw on the students, always valued his reputation. Suddenly, he fell for a young girl. Come on, some mediocre girl who wanted to organize her studies in such a way. That would be understandable, but there's no way to explain the connection with Emily. This girl had rich parents, pretty good-looking, classy. Why would she want a poor teacher with a beer belly? That's a question Camille never found an answer to. The son claimed it was love, but the elderly mother didn't believe in such love. That must be why Emily disliked her. Although Camille never said anything to her face, she voiced her concerns to her son. He got angry, said, "You're a mother. You don't want your son to be happy." On the contrary, she did. She wanted to change his mind to marry him. Why rush headlong into a young student? You should have tested her feelings. He looked at her more closely. What's the rush? If she's afraid that Emily will leave him, if she doesn't propose marriage, it's not love. But her mother's talk didn't change anything. The effect was quite the opposite. Stephen not only did not listen to her, but took offense and stopped communicating with her. He said that he did not ask for her blessing, and did not ask for his life. Camille was very worried, blamed herself for meddling in her son's life, but she felt that Emily was no match for him. Any sane person would have seen a catch, but the mother didn't get anywhere, and she and her son had a falling out. They wouldn't even invite her to the wedding, and she'd almost made peace with the situation. She'd even pick out a suit for the wedding. She withdrew the money. I wanted to give it to her. A trifle, of course, compared to what the matchmakers have. But she wanted to do it out of the goodness of her heart. In the end, she got such a shock when she wasn't invited. Her son didn't speak to her, and she found out from acquaintances that the wedding would take place. She waited till the last minute for an invitation. I thought it was okay. It's a shame. But on a day like this, you could forget about the disagreement. Every day she looked in the mailbox. She didn't go without an invitation. What's the point of humiliating herself? She hasn't gotten over it yet. Like a month later, her son died. She found out about it by accident. She met his co-worker's mother on the bus, and she offered her condolences. Camille got off with a slack jaw at the same stop. I couldn't believe it. How could she? She's the mother. She would have been informed. But I called this co-worker, and he says, yes, it's the funeral today. Overdose. I'm sorry for your loss. And nobody told her about her son's death. So Grandma went to the market this morning. So much for the daughter-in-law in all her glory. What a disgraceful thing to do. Okay, the wedding. But you had to invite her to the funeral. Mother bought a wreath in a hurry and hurried to the cemetery. She didn't have much time. She didn't even go home. However, she took a little money on purpose so that she wouldn't spend too much at the market. That way she limits herself. Otherwise, she might get so broke that she'd spend her entire pension, and that she bought a wreath, and there was no money left for a cab. It wouldn't have been a pity to have time. But I didn't. I could have done it a little sooner. But the gravediggers, having learned that it was the mother of the deceased, decided to meet her halfway, because they had not yet had time to remove the ropes from under the coffin. It was not difficult to do so. They paid no attention to the protests of the infuriated young widow. A mother is sacred. Emily jumped around and threatened the gravediggers, and they took the coffin out and started opening the lid. And shame on you. The widow looked angrily at her mother-in-law, defiling my late husband. Camille didn't even look in the direction of the elderly mother's daughter-in-law. Her hands were shaking and tears were streaming down her cheeks. Emily tried to cling to the older woman, but Stephen's co-workers pulled her away. As soon as the lid was opened, the mother rushed to Stephen and began to kiss him. Then she wailed over the body. "For whom have you left me?" She howled in a low voice. "Get up, son, get up." The hairs stood up from the cries of the desperate mothers. Even the daughter-in-law froze and turned white. Camille could not accept the death of her son. She wailed in despair when she was calm. She would have realized her son wouldn't get up. But now she was insane. But then something strange began to happen. She heard a slight wheeze from her son's nose. The old woman became silent and her crying quieted down, and she heard the wheeze again. Camille pulled herself away from her son's body and crossed herself. Well, the gravedigger came to bury him in a coffin. Yes, he's alive, I think. Excitedly, said the grandmother herself in it. Not believing people looked at her sympathetically. One woman approached her and offered to step back. And he's alive. Camille bent over her son's body again. The woman tried to pull her away from the coffin. Emily's father came to her aid, but the old woman resisted. She kept saying that her son was alive. People began to calm her down to stress and shock state to write it all off. She claimed she wasn't crazy, that she could hear the wheezing. Somebody suggested it was the air coming out of her lungs. Those arguments didn't make the grandmother feel any better. She kept hoping that her son was alive, but Stephen's co-workers were there. They're smart people. They said it's impossible to bury a living person now. There's a death certificate. While the gravediggers calmed the grandmother, they hurried to do their work. But when they began to lower the lid on the coffin, one of them froze. Grandma was right. The dead man was alive. He was breathing. Definitely alive, exhaled the gravedigger, looking closely at the body. Dead man alive, he shouted. Camille broke free from the comforting woman's arms and rushed to her sister-in-law. Hold her perky grandmother clutched at her white-haired young daughter-in-law. Hold that louse here. She was holding it herself, though. Emily had no chance of escaping her mother-in-law's clutches, unless she lost her hair, because her grandmother was ready to tear it out. The two women fell to the ground and continued to fight. The older one had the advantage. She was old, but she had a body, and Emily had dieted so much that she was not strong enough. A young woman covered in earth tried to fight off the perky old woman. Witch, witch! She took it off me, Emily shrieked. But people were in no hurry to separate them. Some were filming them and others were fussing over the coffin. Then Emily's father rushed to his daughter's aid, and other people began to help separate them. Meanwhile, the dead man stood up in the coffin and asked hoarsely, "What's going on here?" Emily shook herself off. Her parents looked at the resurrected son-in-law with confusion, and the elderly mother rushed to her son. Later, her daughter-in-law tried to approach him, but her mother-in-law pushed her away and told her that she belonged only in prison. Someone had already called law enforcement, so the unfortunate widow had to explain how they tried to bury a living person at the station. Later, she unconvincingly told them that she knew nothing, that she was not guilty of anything. But the investigation found out that this young woman and her parents were members of a criminal group. They kept several clandestine laboratories for the production of psychotropic substances banned in civil circulation. Emily's family wanted to expand their business, and they needed a new range of products, so they were looking for a talented chemist to come up with new formulas for them. And Stephen was the best option for the student needed to turn the teacher's head, marry him off. And then, for the sake of his beloved, he would do anything. The girl had no trouble fooling the aging man. But when Stephen realized what they wanted from him, he wanted to go to the police, but did not have time. He did not count on how large-scale everything is organized in the family and his wife. Thinking that Emily had naively gone along with her parents and things could still be changed. He tried to set her on the right path over a cup of tea, and Emily slipped something into his drink. And then the young wife, with the help of her parents, made it look like an accident. While under the substances, the man went into a lethargic sleep, but he was not dead, as the criminals believed. Of course, an autopsy was out of the question. The matter was settled with bribes. Emily hated her mother-in-law, so she did not see fit to inform her about the funeral. Stephen pointed out the location of the laboratories of the organizers of this business. Detained still at the cemetery and in the near future freedom did not threaten them. And the man was grateful to his mother for giving him life once again. He apologized for not listening to her. He promised that he would continue to think with his own head and not in the wrong place.